Drawing a fiddle leaf fig tree is way easier than you think, and I'm going to show you exactly how you can do it, no matter your skill level. Hello little people, it's Genevieve, and my goal here on this channel is to teach you all about illustration and design. So if you're new, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the weekly videos and so that you can join our wonderful creative community. And with that said, grab your drawing tools and let's get started. In this video, I'm going to be using Procreate on the iPad Pro, but you can definitely follow along using your favorite digital art software. The first thing to do is to create a new canvas to draw in, of course. So here are the dimensions of the canvas that I am using, but make sure that you create one that works with your own requirements for your own project. If you're not sure what that means, I have a video that I will link in the description below and in the annotations right now, in which I explain everything you need to know in order to pick a canvas size for digital art. And the reason these are dimensions of my canvas is just because I'm painting in a pre-textured file, which as you can see has some paper texture to it. It is obviously optional, but if you want to check it out, it will be linked in the description below. It is part of my big brush bundle. And with that out of the way, let's start sketching. So create a new layer and rename it to Sketch. Now to sketch, you can use whichever color that you like. I like to just go with a pretty simple neutral gray, but we won't see the sketch in the final result, so seriously, you just pick whichever color that you want. Now in this video, I'm always going to be suggesting two brushes. One is going to be a free brush that comes with Procreate, and the other one is a brush that could help you bring your art to the next level, save some time, and get more professional results. So it would be a watercolor brush that comes from my big brush bundle. If you want to check it out, it is linked in the description below, along with a special promo code for the YouTube people. So to sketch, you can either use the HB pencil that comes in the sketching panel or the coloring pencil from the Ultimate Watercolor brushes. Honestly, again, the sketch we're not going to see in the final result, so the brush doesn't matter at all. And you can simply start by sketching a rectangle for the pot. And here on this channel, we're all about being loose in the sketch, so don't worry about having one perfect line. We're going to find the right one later when we add the color. For now, you can have a big mess of lines. And once you have your pot, just go ahead and draw a slightly curved line for the stem. Again, don't worry, you can have as many messy lines as you need. And from there, we're going to start adding the leaves. And the thing with fiddle leaf figs is the leaves are just these big triangular things. So seriously, you can have so much fun here and you don't need to overcomplicate it. One thing to keep in mind though is you don't want them to all be pointing in the same direction and be fully flat. So you can see here I'm drawing one that is kind of behind the stem and then another one that is hidden by one of the lower leaves. And you can also kind of add this impression that they're folded, so just kind of drawing these double lines. It's going to make more sense when we're adding the colors, but you can see in the example kind of what it's going to look like. So just go ahead and draw a bunch of rounded triangles around your stem, and once you're happy with the layout of your leaves, we're going to start adding the color. And just before we start adding the color, I like to set my sketch layer to multiply and then lower the opacity until you can just barely see it. And setting it to multiply is optional, but it's going to help to see the sketch better on darker colors that way. You can then create a new layer, putting it below the sketch and renaming it to Leaves. This layer is just normal blending mode and 100% opacity. So for the color, you want to pick a green that is pretty much right between yellow and blue. And you want to make sure that it is not too dark and not too bright either. So kind of in the middle of your color chart, I guess. For the brush, you can use in the airbrushing panel the hard brush and then lower the opacity. You can experiment with that, but somewhere, around 50% is good. And so if we draw now, we're going to get some sort of an overlay effect, which is going to be really, really helpful for this watercolor tutorial. That being said, you're not going to get any of the texture, but that's fine. You can still work around. I'm going to show you a bunch of tricks on how to make it look more watercolor if you don't have the paper. If you do have the watercolor brushes though, go ahead and pick the Dark Edges watercolor. And since we're using watercolor brushes or brush with a lowered opacity, we want to draw each leaf, if possible, in one stroke, so without lifting the pencil basically. So for that, I highly recommend that you just start with the outline and then without lifting the pencil, you just color it in. It doesn't need to be super precise, but that way we're going to avoid having some weird overlaps, because overlaps are important, but we want to use them right. So for now, just try to avoid creating any overlaps, but if you do have some, it's not the end of the world, trust me. And one thing that's really helpful as well with fiddle leaf figs, their leaves are just all wobbly, so it's fine if your shapes are kind of funky and a bit strange. That's actually going to make your piece look even better in the end. And it's time for the secret password. So if you've watched this far in the video, please leave a comment saying houseplants. I know it might sound a little bit crazy, but it's been so great doing this over the past few weeks. It's giving me a lot of insight into how to edit and pace my videos better, which helps me create better tutorials for you guys. It's also really cool because you guys know me, but I don't know you. So whenever you leave a comment, I get to see your name or username, face even sometimes. And it's just great to see the wonderful creative community that we're building here on this channel. So leave a comment saying houseplants and we'll keep going. And once you have all your basic color, well, your leaves basically outlined, filled in, when you have your basic shapes for your leaves, we're going to go in and add a little bit of color variation to make it feel more like watercolor. So for that, you can either use the medium brush, making sure that you lower the opacity again, or if you have the watercolor brushes, go ahead and pick the basic watercolor brush, which should be the first one. And you can use the same color because we're just going to start layering, so creating this overlay effect that we were talking about earlier. So you can really place the overlay effect wherever you want. I personally like to have it wherever there is a fold in the leaf, as you can see here. And keep in mind that every time you lift the pencil, it kind of resets the overlay. So the more layers you do, the darker and more intense the color is going to look. So you can really take that to your advantage. And you can see here, I'm being really quick and loose because we do want to have some of these strange, not super controlled lines, because that's really what's going to give us the feel of watercolor. We want to have something that looks organic, that looks like it's flowing and looks like it's not perfectly, straight and digital. So go ahead and kind of scribble. Honestly, you want to get something that looks a little bit random. You do want to have some sharp edges where the leaf folds, but you also want to make sure you have some more random splotches and scribbles, because later in the process we're going to blend everything in together, and this is really where we're going to be building the watercolor effect. So this step is really important. It is not a complicated one, but make sure you take your time to do it properly, and by properly I mean make sure you just do it. And you can hide the sketch at this point. It might be helpful to just see what you're working with. And you're going to repeat the step at least 2 or 3 times with slightly different colors. So here I'm just going to make my green a little bit more gray. You might want to change the hue as well, but for now I'm just going to keep it with the same hue and just make it less saturated. And with the same brush and the same technique, which is just scribbling, we're going to add this other color to add more color variation, which is going to help us create a more realistic watercolor effect in the end. So especially if you're using the free Procreate brushes, you want to make sure that you do this step multiple times to create some color variation and some randomness in the way the color is applied on your canvas. So take your time here. Again, it is not complicated. You can see it looks really crazy right now, but that is normal. The crazier it looks, the better it's going to look in the end. So experiment here, have fun, get out your inner child and just scribble random colors. And seriously, nothing more complicated than that, but take the time to do it. It is so important. I can't stress this enough. So I'm going to do it one more time with a slightly different version of my green. This time I'm going to make it way grayer and just pretty much going over the same spots but with random shapes again, making it feel really crazy and weird. This is really a trust the process kind of situation, but trust me and trust the process, it's going to look good when we start blending everything in. So again, if you're using free brushes, make sure that you do this step with, at least 2 or 3 more colors to have as much variation as you can. It's going to make a big difference in the end, trust me. And once you have something roughly like that, we're going to actually move on to creating the branch and the path, and then we're going to mix everything in together. So go ahead and create a new layer, rename it to branches, and you can put it below the leaves layer if you're able to. For some reason I was struggling, but there we go, we did it. So you might want to reactivate your sketch in this case and just zoom in. And for the color, I recommend that you go with a brown that is not super dark and also not super saturated, something a little bit like that. And in terms of brushes, you can go back to either the hard brush in the airbrushing panel, making sure again that the opacity is lowered, or the dark edges watercolor. And you're going to make sure that the brush itself is set to fairly small. You're then going to draw one continuous line for the entire stem, and you can then add 2 or 3 more at the bottom to kind of thicken the bottom of the stem and also create some of the bark feel to it. So something like that. You can also go ahead and add some little nubs on the stem, something super simple like this, but it really helps, I feel, make the plant look a little bit more interesting and more full than to have just a straight, you know, stem in the middle. So something like this, honestly, you're good to go. We're then going to create the pot, so for that create a new layer, rename it to pot, and you're going to keep it above the branches but below the leaves. So for the pot layer, you can really pick whichever color you want. I'm just going to go with a terracotta pot, so I'm just using the same brown as for the branch, but I made it lighter, so that way I know the browns are going to work well together. Now, tracing the pot can be a little bit tricky, so don't worry if it takes you a few times, but try to draw the top in one swoop, in one stroke, so without lifting the pencil, and then drawing the bottom again in one stroke without lifting the pencil. If the shape is strange, that's fine. We're gonna tweak it in the end, it's okay. For now, just try to not have too many overlaps, because again, we want to control the overlaps as much as we can. Even if it means the shape is not perfect, that's fine, we're gonna clean it, I promise. And just like for the leaves, we're gonna switch the brush back to either the medium brush or the basic watercolor brush, and we're going to add the controlled overlaps. So for the pot, that might be kind of in the area where the top meets with the bottom. You want to have a shadow there, and you might also want to have a shadow on one side. In my case, I'm just going with the right side, so I'm pretending that my light source is on the left of the pot. So something like this, nothing complicated, and again, make sure that you have kind of random little spots so that when we blend in everything later, it does look a little bit more watercolor and less like digital painting or digital drawing. And feel free to pause the video here to take all the time you need to add your color variation, and we'll meet in the next step, which is creating the digital or watercolor effects. So at this point, we want to hide the sketch because otherwise it's going to be really hard to work. So just hide your layer, and then we're going to blend all the crazy stuff that we've been drawing so that it actually starts looking good. And for that, you can either use the smudge tool here, which is this finger icon, setting it to the soft brush. Smudge tools are available in most digital art software, and usually it is a finger icon. And if you have the watercolor brushes, you can set your paintbrush to the water blender. So not the smudge tool, really the paintbrush. And then all you're going to do is, well, as you can imagine, blend the weird digital edges. You don't want to blend everything in. You want to make sure that the folds on the leaves still have crisp edges. You just want to blend kind of the color variation blotches and splotches that you've drawn on your leaf. That being said, don't over blend them. Since we're drawing something with watercolor, especially if you're using the smudge tool and the free brushes from Procreate, you want to make sure that there are still some splotches in there and some color variation that doesn't look really smooth, because that's how you're building your watercolor texture. So this step is super, super important. It's finding the right balance between blending and leaving some edges, basically. So something like this is what you're aiming for. And once your leaves are just blended enough, go ahead and do the same thing on the pot. So just switching to the pot layer with the same brush or the same smudge tool, just going in and kind of blending, not too much, not too little, just enough. And make sure that you keep the separation between the top of the pot and the bottom of the pot. That is an edge that needs to stay sharp. Now, we're also going to blend in the branch or the stem, however you want to call it. But for that, you can switch, if you have the watercolor brushes, to the water drag. Otherwise, you can just keep the exact same smudge tool. And basically the water drag, the way it works is you need to make a lot of small little strokes in the same direction that you want to blend. So basically we're switching here because the water drag is a little bit more precise, but also because it's going to allow you to retain a little bit more texture, which is great because we want to have kind of the bark texture in the branch like I was telling you about when we were first drawing it. So yeah, water drag is going to allow you to retain that texture a little bit better and easier than the water blender. And with that done, we're ready for the magic trick that's really going to give you a lot of watercolor textures and color variation in your leaves. So select the leaves layer and then use the selection tool, set it to freehand, and make sure that the color fill here option is deactivated. You're then going to create a random wobbly shape in the bottom right section of your leaves, and you're going to feather that selection somewhere between 15 and 20%, around 20% honestly is good. You're then going to select the adjustment panel, hue, saturation, and brightness, apply it to the entire layer. So this is going to allow you to change the colors of your selection. So here, since we're drawing the bottom, we might want to create a shadow, so you can lower the brightness a little bit. You can also play with the hue, maybe making this color a little bit more blue and maybe lowering the saturation so that it is slightly more gray. And you can already see that you have so much more color variation in your piece already, but we're going to repeat this step a few more times. This time we're going to do it mostly focusing on the top of the tree. So again, a wobbly selection, then feathering this selection somewhere, around 20%, and going back to hue, saturation, and brightness to the entire layer. You're going to this time up the brightness to create some lights. You might also want to shift the hue towards the left, which is going to make it a little bit more yellow. And you can either up or lower the saturation depending on what you want. So these settings here, you don't have to copy the numbers that I have. You can really experiment and find something that you like. It is for your personal preference, but this is what I'm going to go with. And you're going to repeat this step at least one last time, but this time over the entire tree. And you're going to feather this selection this time around 15%. Going back to the hue, saturation, brightness in the adjustment panel, this time you're going to mostly play with the hue and the saturation, so not much the brightness. You can if you want, but I like to just make it feel like we have different pigments of watercolor in there, so changing the hue and the saturation mostly. So you can see already our tree is just totally different than it was before, but we're going to add even more texture and even more details. But before that, don't forget to use the same selection technique on the pot, so selecting the bottom right layer, feathering the selection around 20%, going back to hue, saturation, and brightness, and lowering the brightness. On the pot, I just do it once just to add a little bit of a shadow. I don't bother as much as for the leaves because the pot is not the main focus, but you could redo this step a few times on the pot as well if you would like to. And if you've made it this far in the video, congrats, that was the hardest part. Now we're just going to make everything look so good by adding details. So to start, we're going to create a mask on our leaves layer. So to do that, just tap on the leaves layer and select mask in the layer option. So everything we're going to erase on this layer mask is going to make a hole in the leaves layer behind it, but it's not actually going to erase the color that we worked so hard to apply on the leaf layer. So something like this, you can see it looks like it erased, but if we deactivate the mask, no, the leaves are still there. And if you're not familiar with masks in digital art, I have a video that I will link in the description below in which I teach everything you need to know about masks and how to use them, so you can definitely check it out. But for now, just go ahead and set your eraser to the soft airbrush that is in the airbrushing panel, a very small size. And we're just going to erase the veins of the leaf. So for that, you can just start with one line in the middle of a leaf and then adding some secondary veins, I guess, that point slightly towards the top of the leaf and that are slightly curved. So something a little bit like this. It doesn't need to be perfect. We're drawing a plant, so it needs to look organic. It needs to look natural, flowy, soft, all of the above. So make sure that you really loose in your wrist, and if there's a line that you don't like, just undo. By the way, if you want to undo in Procreate, just tap with 3 fingers on the screen. You can also use the erasing technique to kind of sharpen the edge of the fold of the leaves. So that can be useful, but don't overdo it. You want it to be very subtle. So something a little bit like what I just did right there. And I'm gonna speed up the video a little bit here so that it doesn't take forever. Feel free to pause or just keep watching at the same time as I am drawing. But basically, we're just doing the same thing over and over again, which is drawing the middle stem and then adding some secondary, middle vein, and then drawing some secondary veins that connect with the sides of the leaves. And that's going to really bring your piece to life. You can also use this layer to kind of erase any overlaps that you might have between leaves themselves, or between the leaves and the middle stem. So this layer is not necessarily a layer to clean up, meaning if you have a leaf that is all weirdly shaped, this is not the layer we're going to clean it up. But if you do have some overlaps and things that you know are not supposed to be there, this is where we're going to erase them. And once you have all your veins erased, we're actually going to exit the mask, so just tapping on the leaves layer again. Now the leaves layer is going to be the one that is highlighted, and with the same eraser we're going to actually go ahead and clean up everything that might be kind of strange. So anything that you know you'd never want to bring back, so like weird smudges or something like that, you're going to erase. No need to keep them by using the mask or something, just get rid of them. So erase them straight on the actual leaf layer. And if you've drawn with the dark edges watercolor brush, try to not erase too much of the edges of the leaves, because if you do that, you're going to lose some of the texture that comes with the brush, which would be a shame, but I mean, you gotta do what you gotta do. And once your leaves are all cleaned up, go ahead and do the same thing with the pot. And for the pot, you might need to do a little bit of a more intense intervention in sense of like reshaping your pot quite a lot. So don't be afraid to do it. This is the step to do it. This is where you want to make sure that the pot is the shape you want it to be. But don't worry too much about it being perfect, because watercolor, you have a little bit more leeway in the sense that it doesn't need to be, you know, the crispest and nicest shape. It can be a little bit more organic and flowy, and that's totally fine. And don't worry if you end up with a gap between the pot and the plant, you can just use the arrow tool to lift up the pot a little bit, and you're gonna fix it in just a few seconds. And although the plant looks almost done right now, believe me, this next step is the most important of the entire tutorial, so don't skip it. It is to create a new layer above everything, renaming it to details and lowering the opacity. For now, we're just going to put it at around 50%, keeping the blending mode at normal. And you're going to pick a dark spot on your leaf, so one of the darkest spots. Now for the brush, you can either use the HB pencil in the sketching panel, if I can find it, there we go. Or if you have the watercolor brushes, go back to the coloring pencil. And here, what we're going to do is we're going to add some details to really make this tree come to life. So I like to kind of outline the area where the leaves are folding over each other, so kind of something like this. And I also like to outline the veins. So I'm going to do it on this leaf here because you're going to see it really well. But just one side of the vein, I add a dark outline to kind of make it pop a little bit more. I also like to do that with the secondary vein, so you can see it kind of creates a little triangle in the corner, one of the corners of the section of the leaf. If that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, don't worry, just look at the video and it will be really clear, I promise. So you can do that on all of your leaves, and you can also kind of roughly outline some parts of the outlines or the outside of the leaves, so the edges, to kind of make them pop a little bit more. Make sure that you don't overdo it though, because otherwise it's going to start looking less like watercolor. But if you do it just a little bit, it is just going to make, like I was saying, your piece pop so much more. And for now, the opacity is quite high of this layer, so the lines look quite intense. But don't worry, we're going to lower the opacity once we're done with everything so that they blend in really well. We're also going to use this layer to draw the veins on the folded part of the leaf. So just pretend that the vein is going over the folded part and then creates a V. So something like that, and we're just going to keep the second part of the V. So just pretend and then flip. Pretend and then flip. So that way you are sure that the veins are roughly lining up with the inside and the outside, meaning the folded part and the non-folded part. So we're going to do it on this side as well. So pretend, then flip, pretend, then flip, pretend, then flip, pretend, flip, pretend, flip. And I'm just going to add an extra one here, otherwise it looks a little bit strange. And you can also kind of blend them with the bottom line, the bottom edge of the folded leaf, just a little bit, something like this. And seriously, that's it. And we're just going to repeat the same technique on all the leaves, and trust me, once you're done with this step, you're going to be so happy you did it. So make sure you take all the time you need. It should not be super long here. We're really going kind of quickly with the strokes. We're not, you know, we're kind of using a sketching approach to these strokes. They're not perfect and smooth and like straight and beautiful outlines. They're rougher outlines and sketchier lines. But still, take the time to do it, and this is what's going to make your piece feel complete and professional as opposed to a little bit, you know, more bland, I guess, if I want to be polite. So feel free to pause the video here and we'll meet on the next step, which is adding more details on the pot and then adding even more watercolor effects on your whole piece. Okay, so once you have a bunch of details on your leaves, outlines and everything, it is time, like I was saying, to actually play with opacity so that everything blends in. It's going to depend on your own colors that you use. So go ahead and pick something that you like. In my case, it was around 38%. And then we're going to add the same little technique for the pot. So picking a dark brown that was on the pot and then just adding some details. In my case, I'm pretty much just going with this line here between the top and the bottom of the pot. And then just kind of refining the corners a little bit, but nothing more because again, we want the leaves and the tree to be the focus part, not the pot. Another really fun thing you can do is adding some splatters. So to do that, create a new layer above everything. Rename it to splatters. In this layer, we're going to change the blending mode of to linear burn. It's just going to make the splotches blend better with the base color. And you might want to lower the opacity around, 70%, but you can always tweak it later. You're going to go back and pick the green that you use for the leaves and either use the splatter brush that comes in the watercolor bundle or on these spray paint brushes that comes with Procreate. There is a splatter brush, but it looks quite strange, so I would not necessarily recommend it. You can use the Giclée brush here. It is quite dense, but it's better than nothing. You can also draw the splatters by hand, which is the regular hard brush. But yeah, if you have the watercolor brushes, just use the splatter brush and you can see it is super easy and it just kind of ties in the piece together. Make sure you don't overdo it though. You just want to have a few splatters here and there, nothing more than that. And you can also kind of add some that are brown around the pot if you want. It is optional. I'm gonna do it. I just think, little details like this makes the piece really more coherent and just looks more finished overall. And this little tree here is really nice, but it looks a little bit lonely on the white page. So I highly recommend you go ahead and check out this video in which I'm going to teach you how to draw a monstera so that you can have more houseplants in your illustration. So just click on the link right here and I'll meet you there.